Welcome back to podcast 9. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm David Waselkow with my co-host Tyler Burke. This is the
Hello.
Framework Podcast. How are you?
I'm awesome,
As always.
as always. It's a trend.
It is a trend.
It maybe it has something to do with this podcast.
I think your awesomeness precedes and itself and replicates itself.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. The golf game is very slowly and painfully improving, but little bits of improvement here and there.
Yeah. It's something to see, I'll say that.
Excuse me, and that part is consistent.
It
It
is.
is something to see.
It's exciting. You never know really what you're gonna get. And it's a hoot.
It is a hoot.
Yeah.
A hoot and a half. I gotta get Jim Venetos to speak more to Driver. He avoids that subject like a plague, and I know why. I know his why behind that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like the final frontier. I have a bad relationship with my driver.
I think it's the club.
Well, we know somebody who is convinced that everything is problematic with the club and not the fundamentals or the swing.
And he usually beats us.
He did, yeah, pretty handily, except in putting.
Here we go.
Here we go. Inside joke.
Mm-hmm.
But germane to tonight's topic,
Mm-hmm.
I would estimate that virtually everyone has heard this phrase, even if they don't know necessarily where it comes from. Know thyself. Know thyself. Attributed to Socrates, and it's actually inscribed inside the temple of Apollo in the Greek precinct of Delphi. Know thyself. Go ahead.
I was just trying to think of the quote in Rocky's temple.
Yo, Adrian, Rocky?
Yeah, because Apollo.
Apollo Creed.
Oh, God. This is why you should probably mute me sometimes. But I'm controlling this shit. So sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. You are in control. Yeah, nothing to apologize for. So know thyself. So from a philosophy point of view, not to bore the shit out of everyone, but from a philosophy point of view, Socrates' point of view, it means to understand and be aware of essentially three things: our nature, our limits, and our place in the world. So it's not just about personal reflection, knowing yourself. It's about understanding oneself with those three criteria and really acknowledging the boundaries of your own knowledge and the boundaries of your own abilities. So if you think that you have limitless knowledge or if you have limitless abilities, then you really don't know yourself and you're not being honest with yourself. So true wisdom really comes from knowing yourself, and it allows you to better understand not just the world that you're in, but your place in it. And it's dynamic, not static. It's a lifelong journey. You don't get to a place where you know yourself and stop, because you're constantly evolving, you're constantly growing. So this is a lifelong journey.
Well, I think that's an important point when you're talking about boundaries. Understanding your boundaries, not understanding your lack of potential or end. It's just your current state.
It's
right?
your current state.
But not in no way would that indicate some type of stuckness, limit,
Right.
if you will. Right.
Right. Yeah. Your limits are not finite. Your limits are right now.
Yeah. Oh shit. That was good.
Yeah. How about that?
You should record that.
Wait, did we?
Write that down.
Are we? Somebody write that shit down. That was good.
That was Rocky.
That was Rocky. Limits right now. Okay. So why are we talking about this tonight? Well, one of the very interesting, compelling things that happens frequently in couples and sex therapy is a couple comes in wanting to understand one another, or they think that the problem is they don't understand one another. And the assumption is they got themselves all figured out. It's their partner who has all the problems or all the issues, right? Um, Even more recently, I've had 3 clinical situations of relatively new clients coming in where it's one version or the other of, I have no idea who I am. Uh, Either a person is convinced that they're not good enough, so they try and ascertain what they think other people want them to be, and then they shape shift towards that or aspire to become that.
Hmm.
And if they do and they get really good at that, they get further and further away from themselves such that they reach a point where they legitimately say, "Oh my gosh, I don't know who I am." Another situation is, something like that happens in a marriage, and then the marriage has difficulty, or a person goes through a divorce, and they'll say something like, "I don't know who I am anymore," right? What I say is, to not know thyself is to live an unexamined life. And an unexamined life is a boring, dissatisfying, confusing life. And really and truly, if you're having problems in your marriage or your relationship, while it is natural to focus on partner and what you think your partner's problems or issues are, or why your partner is in the way of you wanting to do or experience what you want to, the truth of the matter is that relationship awareness must begin with self awareness. You cannot successfully do relationship with another person or with a concept, and certainly with yourself, until you can do self awareness. So if you don't know yourself and you don't take the time to examine yourself and examine your life, and how can you conceivably be successful in, find satisfaction in, sustainability in any kind of relationship? So when a couple comes in, or an
Mhm.
individual, but let's just use the example of couples, when a couple comes in, if they're trying to figure out what's wrong with their partner, or if they're spending all their time analyzing and trying to understand their partner, especially what they think are their partner's deficiencies or inappropriatenesses or excessivenesses, whatever it is, you're missing, I think, more than half the story,
Hmm.
because you don't know who you are. If you don't know who you are, you have no understanding of how you're showing up in a relationship. You have no idea of the unintended consequences of your own behaviors and communications. You have no idea what your contributions or detractions are, right? So, if you want to be successful in any kind of relationship, including the relationship with yourself, you have to know thyself. So that's the topic for tonight.
Hmm. All right. I love it. This seems like one of the first things that you and I really talked in any. We really started getting deep in working together. Was starting to really dig deep into who the hell am I?
Right.
Right. I was pretty. I knew pretty well what I didn't like or didn't want. But it was always um, somewhat superficial. But really down to myself. I had no fucking idea.
Mhm. So
It seemed like it was always about serving, or it was always about giving away, the kids, or
Mhm.
other things,
Right, because it was other focused.
and even kind of role based, or even being a father. I
Mhm.
am a father, but that's not that doesn't encompass all of me.
Mhm.
But that was so much of my identity and role, um, right?
Absolutely, and when we are immersed in other focus, there's so much of us that's unavailable for that internal focus.
Mhm.
And then living in society the way it is, if you are focused on yourself, then people may call that selfish on one end of the
Mhm.
continuum. On the worst end of the continuum, they'll use the overly used term of narcissist on
Mm.
this end,
Mm.
which is so uncommon, yet so unbelievably frequently used and misused, that term, narcissism. But what we're really talking about is you have to know yourself in order to know how to do relationship. And if you don't know yourself, how can anybody else know you?
Mhm.
Right. And it's easy to get lost. So I've gotten lost in a horrendous relationship myself, similar to how you did, different but similar.
Mhm.
And one of the beautiful benefits of being with the right relational partner, but also more importantly, one of the beautiful benefits of making a commitment to be a good relational partner, which is a commitment that I made before I got into another relationship,
Mm.
was this: know thyself. We've talked before about the concept of self esteem and talked about some authors who have, written prominently on that. And I always say, borrowing from one of those authors, that self esteem is a consequence of joining together self awareness and self acceptance. Well, so now we're on the self awareness side of things. Know thyself. So, how do we understand and become aware of our nature, our limits, and our place in the world? How do we see and acknowledge the boundaries of our knowledge and of our abilities? That's the subject.
Well, that's why they invented women, to tell you all that
To
shit.
tell you all those things.
Mhm.
This is who
To
you are.
to
Yeah.
go ahead, that's
All right. Let's start with nature. Um, how does one begin to understand and become aware of their nature?
Mm. Use more words about nature.
Well, you could take this a lot of different ways. You could say it's perhaps your innate disposition or your personality. It could be the opposite of whatever you determine to be nurture. So, for example, if who you are is a product of bad relationships, then you have to strip away the relational experience to rediscover the authentic self.
Mm.
If you didn't listen to a previous podcast and you put your best foot forward instead of your authentic foot forward, you probably did a good job of losing yourself
Mm.
in a relational situation because you were trying to be one thing instead of being who you are. But being who you are assumes you know who the fuck that is in the first place.
Mm.
And I would submit to you that one of the most common problems in the human condition is that people really don't know, really don't understand who they are, what their nature is. And if they do, it doesn't come with self acceptance. Very often, what is called self
Mm.
awareness is an engine for shame.
Mm.
Well, this is who I am, and I don't like that about myself, or this is what I do, and I'm ashamed of it. Right. So, that combination of self awareness and self acceptance isn't working together because it's being leveraged for shame, for punishment,
Mhm.
for guilt. Right. So, what is one's essential nature? You might say, well, I'm a giver or a taker. Maybe that's in your nature, or maybe that's because of your nurture,
Mm.
or a combination of the two. I say our nature is really our rules, our
Mm.
values.
Mm.
This is why I think the framework is applicable globally. Our nature is Needs, wants, desires, fantasies, preferences, our rules, our needs. And one of the first really damaging, deleterious things we do to ourselves and the world does to us is shame us for having those things in the first place, teaching us that we shouldn't, or teaching us that they're bad, or that that's selfish, or what have you. And so we limit our knowledge, our understanding of ourselves, and that limitation is because of shaming or punishment.
Mm.
So, what is one's nature as it relates to applying the framework in a very real way to improve your life and improve your relationship every day? Well, our nature is understanding, identifying what our rules are. What are our values?
How many people come into your office just covered in shame?
Virtually everyone.
Hmm.
Why do you ask?
Because I think it's probably the root of more than we give it credit for.
Mm,
I mean, people that aren't therapists.
mhm.
You know what I mean? I can think a lot of the stuff that we see on people, certainly folks that would fall into um, probably a life that we would call pretty inauthentic.
Mhm.
Um, but God, it's like it's almost from day one. It seems like people are just exposed to that to whatever degree, and it's just everywhere. It's
It
fucked up.
is. It really, really is, and it's a consequence, as we've said in previous podcasts, and I believe this, of being trained to do prohibitive thinking.
Mm.
You know, the I don't want tos, the I'm afraid ofs, and how that prohibitive thinking writes really bad rules. You should be ashamed of yourself. You know, when you're the
You're
recipient.
not even shaming yourself, right?
Yeah, that's great.
Good
Right.
God.
Yeah. You should be ashamed of yourself. So
Yeah.
the recipient of that message is being judged, shamed, and admonished by somebody else based upon their rules and stuck in a power dynamic and a competition
Mm.
dynamic and told that what they're doing, thinking, saying, feeling is wrong.
Mm.
And if that is how you know yourself, if your examination of your life is all about punishing yourself because you're apparently, quote unquote, making other people feel things or whatever it
Mhm.
is, yeah, you don't know yourself at all.
Seems like so much of the world is driven on rewarding the good and punishing the bad
Mhm.
at its core.
Mm.
I mean, society to parenting to all of it, right? So you get anything outside of anywhere near the wrong part,
Mhm.
and it seems to overpower everything else.
Mhm. Mhm.
Relationships, you name it.
Yeah, and it assumes that there is that norm.
Well, and right and wrong according to who?
Right, right. Yeah, so what is to understand and be aware of one's nature is to understand and be aware of their rules. So, how do you do that? How do you use the framework as a tool to figure that out? Um, Very first step is creating the rule inventory. So we get asked this, and I get asked this a lot. How do I find my rules? How do I know what my rules are? Well, first, begin with a good understanding of the operational definition of rules. What are rules in that definition? They are our values. When we take an inventory, we're capturing a cluster of things that we would consider needs, wants, desires, fantasies, preferences, our values, our rules. The inventory is simply to identify that they are there. The value after that is making a determination about where they came from. So, are those rules that we have ones that are truly authored by us or not? If they're not authored by us, are the rules that we playing by consistent with us? Or have we adopted them? Have we folded them in because that's what we were trained to believe in or trained to do?
Mm. I know I had a really hard time identifying good or positive or negative rules for me, and it seemed like it wasn't until like in the moment where I had either an overwhelmingly positive or negative reaction or emotion to it that I could start to pinpoint what the hell was that, what was going on, and why.
So important that you identified that because when asked that question, how do I find my rules? And sometimes people are surprised by this based upon how I discuss feelings,
Mhm.
because I say feelings are real and feelings matter, but feelings aren't facts. Well, the reason why feelings matter in part, not in total, is they're the beginning of the path. They're the signpost on the path to find your rules. Because that goes back to one of the fundamental or foundational concepts. And that is when you're trying to understand your rules, when you're trying to find your rules, lean into your emotional experiences. Like you just said. So if you're having negative emotions of any kind, that's because rules that you have are being broken or being violated. If you're having positive feelings of any kind, that's because rules that you have are being met. Now, whether you know
Mhm.
that that's the reason or not is a different story. But that's why you do this, so that you can know. So, how do we know what we think we know about our rules? We can lean into our emotional experiences to then find them. So, it's not enough to say, yeah, I'm angry and now I have to be ashamed of that and I'm in trouble for that. My partner says I'm
Mhm.
an asshole because of that.
Mhm.
That's just dealing with the outcome. We got to look at the why behind that. Okay, why am I feeling angry? Well, likely because I'm disempowered. Why am I disempowered? Well, maybe because there's a fear of betrayal going on there. Well, what am I afraid of? Where's the betrayal? Oh, the rule is being betrayed.
Mhm.
Or I'm afraid to acknowledge this rule or advocate for it. Okay. Now I understand my emotional experience. I'm starting to get closer to what this rule business is.
Mhm.
There's a value at stake here for me. So there's the self awareness piece. If we don't have the self acceptance piece with that, that's where shame rushes in, floods in, or we permit someone to trespass upon our boundary and shame us for it because it's maybe inconsistent with one of their rules.
Mm.
So now we're misunderstanding conflict because the essence of conflict is a rule dispute, right? But if our solution is to shame ourselves for the possession of the rules we have and acquiesce to someone else's, that's the recipe for disaster and dissatisfaction.
What's fascinating is what I found anyway was just having the language of the rules helped me overcome shame. Meaning,
Hmm.
experience, when you kind of are in that moment, you're like, fuck, what? And you start to process this feeling, this emotion, whatever, and you're like, oh, I must have a rule that says XYZ as opposed to what a piece of shit I am.
Yeah, right.
Right. We've talked a number of times about separating um, the person from the uh,
Behavior.
behavior and
Hmm.
stuff. Right.
Hmm.
And that's a perfect way to do it just by having the term rule.
Hmm.
Like, oh, God, that's a rule I must have. Let me write that down, take my fucking inventory.
Right.
As opposed to this like magical thing of like, there's this thing and
Right.
it's almost like you're a victim to shit.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, just to point that out, at first the term alone rule
Hmm.
stuck with me and bothered me.
Hmm.
But then it became very much empowering because it was just something that we all have, good and bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And paradoxically, though the point of entry to understanding that is leaning into the feeling,
Hmm.
Once you do that very thing that you're talking about, now you're restoring thinking to an
Mhm.
emotional process.
Yeah.
You can think through things without being overrun by or
Mhm.
fixated upon
Mhm.
how shame feels.
Mhm.
So you can think through it.
Well, and the reason that you have that is not because you're a piece of shit, but a broken rule. I
Right.
keep coming back to that because I think I certainly did, but I think so many people get stuck there
Hmm.
and they can't process anything beyond that.
Right. They can't. And especially if they believe when their partner is calling them a piece of shit,
Mhm.
or if they believe it when they're calling themselves a piece of shit.
Well, and what an amazing, flip it on its ass a little bit. And so you might be upset with the other person. This person's an asshole.
Hmm.
Well, they're not just being an asshole. There's a rule,
Right.
right? And it's a way to differentiate that. Then you can have an actually a productive conversation without just name calling and pointing and
Absolutely.
all the shit.
Because when you're saying this person's being an asshole, if your brain is on board and you're listening to our podcast, then you're remembering a very
Mhm.
important principle, which is that all behavior is goal directed. We're all trying to accomplish something with the behaviors that we select. So if you're evaluating someone else's behavior as evidence of assholia, then what you need to do is
Yeah.
ask yourself, number one, what's your why?
Yeah.
Right? What is the person trying to accomplish? Why is that important to them?
Mhm.
Invariably, what they're trying to accomplish is something that's consistent with a rule that they have.
Mhm.
And that's why it's important to them.
Mhm.
When that becomes the focus instead of the pain of being called an asshole or feeling like an asshole, now we're outside of that realm of those negative, punitive, shaming, punishing feelings in that emotional space. And we're bringing our brain on board to do something productive, sustainable, solution focused, reality based
Mhm.
to find answers.
Mhm. Love it.
Okay, so your nature, right? Maybe you're introverted, maybe you're extroverted, maybe you're altruistic, maybe you're more analytical, maybe you're more assertive, directive. All of those things can be a part of your nature, right? Those things matter to a degree, but really and truly, the essence of you and your nature is the constellation of rules that you have. And if you don't know yourself, then you don't even know what those rules are, let alone where they come from, and therefore live an unexamined life. And if you take all of that and you bring it into a relational situation with another partner and you bring that much ignorance and that much confusion, how can you do relationship awareness? Because there is no self awareness and very likely no self acceptance. So then what? You convert your partner into a surrogate for your own self esteem and sense of identity. You surrender all that power, and now you become a dependent person on the positive or negative evaluation of your partner. Great way to lose yourself.
Mm.
Great way to become a person who says, oh my gosh, I have no idea who I am. And if you're caught up in that shapeshifter chameleon thing, where you're trying to ascertain what is going to be acceptable in the judgment of somebody else, and you're trying to become whatever you think they need or want you to become, great way to lose yourself. Bad rule, by the way.
Mm.
Very bad rule. So, what is nature? It is self awareness and self acceptance on what are your rules. And the way to get there is the inventory. Once you do the inventory, then you can make determinations about the goodness or badness of that particular rule for you and the source of that rule. It's okay to have rules that you didn't write yourself, that didn't originate from inside of you or from your nature, so long as they're consistent with what that is. So that's the nature part.
Okay.
Okay. Understand and be aware of number two, your limits. Here's where I think ego can really be featured
Fuck me.
prominently, one of your favorite
Let's go.
subjects. So, all right, if you think about limitations or limits conceptually in the spirit of what we're talking about,
Mhm.
how would you integrate that into your understanding? How would you describe it, explain it, apply it for yourself?
How would I integrate the concept of limits as it relates to specifically ego?
Or, well, any of it. Yeah. In other words, if a person's listening to us and like, okay, step two is understand and be aware of your limits.
Mhm.
How do you interpret that?
Well, just like I mentioned, my first instinct of it was like, "Oh, fuck you." Um, I don't like to talk about I would rather put my energy on pushing my limits than seeing it as some type of stopping place or something.
Okay.
That's why I like so much, when we sort of changed that or refocused it into understanding basically my current position.
Yep.
That's just reality. I think a lot of times um, I can't say we, I say me. A lot of times I get stuck if I get stuck in not being super aware of positionally where I'm at, then uh, making the next decision becomes almost impossible.
Why?
I don't know where the fuck I am. I don't know. It's like you're in this, or I feel like I'm, um, just off out of place. It's like
Hmm.
right.
Hmm.
Um, I don't. It's so difficult to take the next step if you don't know where you're at.
Right.
So
Yeah. And I often describe that as saying that's like saying we're lost, but we're making
yeah,
good time.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like you trying to find a fairway with your driver,
You had to go there, didn't you?
or yeah, okay,
Yeah.
your lip quiver.
Yeah. Yeah. My traumatic experience. No, it's true. It's a wonderful example, actually, I think. If I'm doing self awareness, then I understand that I'm limited off the tee and have to be very selective about when I try to use my driver.
Mhm,
If I'm doing self acceptance, then that means I'm embracing that I'm in a learning journey instead of getting frustrated or shaming myself or being embarrassed or whatever because it, ricochets off someone's roof
mhm.
or something like that. Good example. The other thing I would say about, oh, go ahead, please.
Well, I think it's kind of what are we not, if we're going to stay on the golf metaphor. And sorry if it's too much, but it's the difference of closing your eyes and swinging as hard as you can, or being intentional and knowing your limits and playing your best shot.
Yeah. Well, and I think even more, that's a great way to put it. It's play within yourself.
Mhm,
Don't attempt shots that you don't have. Don't try things on the golf course that you haven't practiced and worked out on the golf range, on the driving range, or the putting green or chipping, whatever. Play within yourself. In other words, knowing your limitations is a source of empowerment.
mm,
But the problem is people look at what they perceive their limitations to be and use that as something to criticize themselves or shame themselves for.
mm,
I should be able to do this. I ought to be able to do this. So because that's true, I think I'm
mm,
going to go ahead and do it.
mm,
And now you're playing outside of yourself. You don't understand that you have limitations. And that's where I think we see ego driven behavior. There's nothing more ego in golf than drive for show, putt for dough, right? Everybody wants to get on the
mm,
tee box, get the big, loaded, souped up driver and hit the thing a million miles down
mm,
it's all ego and it's ignorance of or really protest behavior on real limitations. But the person who's embarrassed or afraid to acknowledge limitations is the person who doesn't understand themselves, the person who is living an unexamined life.
you had defined ego, um, and I don't have all the right words, but the idea was basically a defense mechanism for threats.
Mhm. Can be, yep. Mhm.
Is that if you're inauthentic, right, and you're sort of in this place, is ego is like authenticity the threat to it? Is that
Well, yeah, if I'm authentic and I'm being honest and being real, I'm not gonna hit my driver off the tee box because I know my limitations,
yeah?
or I'm gonna be selective about it. If I'm inauthentic, I'm ego driven, I wanna be seen as someone who can do this, or I believe I have to do this, or I should do this, or I'm not
Hmm.
manly if I don't do it.
Hmm.
Then I'm playing outside of myself. I'm really doing something that my skill set doesn't possess, and I'm making things worse. And the same thing
Hmm.
happens in marriages all the time. Ego gets in the way of so many things, particularly the male ego, but also female ego too. It depends on what the issue area is. But the point is, you're playing outside of yourself. You don't understand what your limitations are, and you have prohibitive thinking about what limitations mean. To know that you're what your limits are is to know yourself and then play within yourself. And that's the self awareness piece, but also the self acceptance piece. Because who said it was bad to have limitations? Who said it was bad to play within those so that you can develop your competence, develop your skill, and change those? But we all have
Hmm.
limits,
Hmm.
and limits don't have to be a bad thing. But if the way that we conceptualize of limitations is through the prism of prohibitive thinking, then we're off to the bad races.
Seems directly tied to the inability or the lack of enthusiasm to ask for help
Oh, sure. That's a great example.
or admit that you need assistance. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great example.
Hmm.
Yeah. So understanding and being aware of your limitations is fertile ground for shame to rush in, particularly if you're approaching that from a prohibitive thinking point of view. But if you change your view of that towards something that's more reality based and solution focused, knowledge of limitations is empowering. But if you're with a relational partner who believes that your limitations negatively affect them or that you should not have the limitations that you do, that's one of the places where shame rushes in. And there is a rule dispute,
The core of not good enough.
the core of not good enough. And I would submit one of the things that can be the engine of the us and them stuff that you speak of so well and so frequently as well.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
awareness of limitations and acceptance of limitations is empowering. And I don't like to be redundant, but I like to reinforce when I think it's necessary.
Hmm.
Just used a word again, acceptance. Want to be really clear what that word means because most people confuse the words acceptance with endorsement. When we accept something, we're not saying we're all good with it. I'm not all good with the fact that I can't consistently hit my driver off the tee. I'm not good with
Neither are the neighbors
it.
that
Yeah, the only
live
people that are
next to
good
me.
at it are good with it are roofing companies. um, but when I accept it, what am I really doing? I'm acknowledging that reality exists. Well, the reality is there are current limitations in my golf game. And I am working on those things and I'm learning, right? And not getting caught up in shame and frustration and embarrassment. So that can be part of the process, but it's a waste of energy. You know, limitations are empowering when we know what they are, because then we can play within ourselves and we can focus on making the improvements that we want or need to make in order to get better at something,
mm,
right? So let me do something outside of golf. In relationships, romantic relationships, a lot of people have artificial limitations or real limitations, whatever it is, when it comes to sex and eroticism. And one of the problems, let's say, with uh, porn watching or porn discussions in relationships is porn promotes a limitless experience with regard to sex and eroticism. Limitless in terms of sexual competence, sexual knowledge, sexual confidence, right? So when we start thinking that that's how things should be or how we want them to be, and we start advocating for that or wanting that with partner, and then partner starts talking about limitations with regard to competence, confidence, and knowledge, what happens in relationships? That person gets shamed, that person gets made fun of, told that they're not good enough, right? And it's so damaging, and both parties are intensely dissatisfied. On the other hand, if you hide behind your limitations and you use that as a sword
mm,
instead of a shield, then you're failing yourself and failing your partner as well too.
mm,
Limits, like our self-awareness, are not finite. They're not static. They don't exist in perpetuity. And if you invoke them as excuses and reasons for those problems to exist in perpetuity, then that's a problematic rule that you're using to cover for something else.
mm.
But it is entirely appropriate to say, okay, when I honestly assess myself and I'm open to honest feedback from others, here are some limitations I found with regard to sexual knowledge, sexual competence, sexual confidence. So we're going to play within that for now as a matter of acceptance. But we're not endorsing it. We're simply accepting it. That reality, we're acknowledging that it exists.
Mhm.
And since we're now choosing to no longer live an unexamined life, we're going to examine, okay, where did that lack of competency, that lack of knowledge, that lack of confidence come from? What are the sources of that? What are the problems of that? And I'm going to work on that so that my limits change, my limits sort of expand, right? Again, empowerment. Limitations are not excuses for bad behavior, for disengagement, for lack of effort. Instead, limitations are acknowledgments that reality exists and an understanding of where we are at any given moment.
I've never thought about limits in this way.
Mm,
Like we're in the limit of being between yesterday and tomorrow.
hmm, hmm, hmm. Yeah.
That's not, and to be outside of that is unrealistic, right?
Mm,
It's not bad. It's not negative. It's just it's where we're at,
hmm.
and that well, that example I guess will never change. But I'm thinking as you're talking about it that you know we're in the boundaries of this. It's kind of freaking me out a little bit. Because you always hear like the things like, oh, you know, push your limits and do the things. I even said it when we first started. Um, but you get outside of that and it just becomes false and inauthentic and not reality at all.
Hmm. Yeah. To be limitless isn't a thing,
Yeah. Mm,
but don't confuse that with the idea that limits are static because everything is dynamic, including us.
mhm,
We're constantly growing and evolving in this slow incremental process of evolutionary change over time with an
mhm,
occasional leap here and there.
mhm,
The limits adjust. And by the way, the limits can expand and contract. Okay. So understanding limits in a given moment or a given situation is a statement of right now,
mm,
but it's not a statement of what tomorrow will be or what yesterday once was. One of the places where limitation, negatively oriented, shows up the most is in chronic pain patients. They will invoke the unfairness that they perceive befalling them because of all the limitations that they experience and believe that pain is causing them. This happens in trauma also, right? But those limitations, while real, when acknowledged, can be powerful, but when used as an excuse not to do something, or when thought of as something that can never change and is always static, that's where the errors come from cognitively. And that's where the emotional distress comes from. And that's when you start hearing people say things like, well, you just simply can't understand me unless you go through the pain that I go through. Stuff like that,
Hmm.
where you let the pain do you instead of you doing and managing the pain. And this dynamic that we're talking about is just as true in pain as it is in sex and eroticism, as it is in golf, as it is in any other thing. To know thyself is to understand not just what your limits are, but what limits actually mean. And limitation doesn't mean something negative. It's a statement of reality, if we're honest. And that reality is relatively transient, meaning it's likely to change and evolve. It's certainly something that can be influenced
Hmm.
by a number of factors, including us and our wherewithal to improve it.
Hmm.
So, if you're going to be lazy and satisfied with low levels of sexual competence, for example, and use that as an excuse to be a lazy partner, that's limitations weaponized.
Hmm. Limitations weaponized,
Mm-hmm.
bitch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
There's a lot rolling around in that grape
Well,
of
you're
yours.
laying some shit down right now. You got to give me a second to work my way through all this. Limitations weaponized, and that's probably. And I would imagine that that's probably more unintentional than intentional in most cases. It's probably someone else who's just not
Yeah.
that self-aware.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And notice what you just said. Probably someone that's not that self aware. So, limitations in their self awareness are
Mm-hmm.
producing conclusions or negative false conclusions that are taking root as if they're true.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're operating from them as if they're true.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no better way to create false or negative limitations than prohibitive thinking. Because if I'm afraid to and I don't want to, that is my limitation. But that limitation is artificial as
Wait,
opposed to natural.
well, I mean, it seems like you're also talking about projecting a prohibitive thought.
Sure.
Like, oh, you're not going to do this. Well, I'm not even going to ask about that. You're never do that shit,
Nice.
right?
Yep.
Mm,
Which is a shaming technique.
mm.
Well, I'm not going to ask for oral sex because you're never going to do it anyway. So,
And you get mad for getting rejected, and you haven't even asked.
and you haven't exactly.
Not that I've ever been in that situation.
Oh, no. We're talking hypotheticals here.
Mhm. Okay.
So, a lot inside know thyself. We got nature, we
Mhm.
got limits. And I think one of the fundamental takeaways here is again, words matter, terminology matters. All the time we're walking around using words and nodding our heads like we know what the fuck is being said or what we're talking about. We don't really think about the meaning of those words. I would submit that most people think limits means something negative. Oh, they've got limitations,
Mhm.
us and them, right? Or I've reached my limit.
Mm.
Okay. Good to acknowledge that you're approaching or have approached your threshold for tolerance on something. And that is a limit. Knowing that is empowering. It's not a sign of weakness or defect or anything else, so long as you're not weaponizing it and invoking it as an excuse for bad behavior or poor choices.
Mhm.
And it's not static, right? Our limitations, whatever they are, and we all have them and they're all real, they are dynamic. And paradoxically, just like any other change, we cannot address them, we cannot improve them until we first acknowledge that they are there. And if we're shaming or doing punishment or embarrassment or whatever, that makes that acknowledged piece really hard, if not impossible. Right. So, your limits, understanding and being aware of your limits is an exercise in honesty. It's an exercise in self awareness, self acceptance, and I would submit self love.
Mm.
This is the relationship with yourself we're talking about. And then imagine what happens if you apply that to relationship with others or with concepts. There are limitations. As Clint Eastwood famously said in Unforgiven, every man's got his limitations, right? Yeah, that's
Mm.
true for right now.
Mm. Seems like that's probably where a fair amount of peace would come from, would
Mm.
be accepting your limits.
Ooh, I really like that. Can you speak more to that? Peace through acknowledgement.
Well, yeah, I would imagine that, and it seems like if I experience that, there's, it just feels good. It feels positive to be okay with whatever realm is inside those limits,
Hmm.
whether it's today, it's this situation, whatever. It's just like, it is what it is this,
Hmm.
and I'm okay with it. Um, that seems to be this place where humility is going to live a lot. It's going to be a place where peace is going to live a lot. Um, and now we're talking about having language to be able to negotiate into those places, either alone or with someone else.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
fucking great.
Well said. Yeah.
Yeah.
As I was listening to you, one of the other places where I think, just by way of example, that this can show up that way positively is when we confront failure. We always say failure is a positive thing.
Mhm.
Failure is
Can be.
progress towards success, can be, right? Well, what is failure? Failure is, in some way, the reaching of an limitation at any point in time.
Mhm.
So, when there is that failure, it is a signal of where a limit is. And if we're not acknowledging that limit and we're focusing on the shame of failure, then we're missing all of the value and the peace and really the comfort and the awareness that comes from that and the growth opportunity that comes from that. Then again,
Mhm.
when limits are artificial, then what happens is people say, well, I don't want to try because that's hard. Or they'll say that's impossible, and they're confusing impossible with hard, right? So remember, self awareness helps us identify the artificial limits as well as the realistic limits. And it's imperative that we do both.
Mhm.
And the only way to do both and to be aware of both is to examine it, to know thyself, understand and be aware of your nature and your limits.
Mhm.
Okay.
I wonder if
Third.
there's a different word for limit, like rule. I think there's such a
Mm.
negative connotation to it sometimes. It's actually a beautiful thought.
Mm-hmm.
I wish there was a different term. You should come up with. You need to find a different term for it. You have to do it right now, but maybe we should think about it and then write it down.
It's interesting that you say that. Why do you wish that so much?
Well, I mean, like I sort of alluded to earlier, where a lot of the language that we're talking about is really empowering.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's easy until you really get a grasp on exactly what the hell we're saying. It's easy to lose people um,
Yeah.
in a first impression.
Yeah.
So if it didn't have the immediate negative connotation to it, it'd be easier. But it's not a, you know, deal breaker. It's just a it's a small hurdle to overcome anytime this is a new introduction of a new concept to someone.
Absolutely. And so isn't it interesting that the why behind that in part is, well, geez, we feel bad calling it that. But when we examine the definition and we do honesty and explanation of the definition, the way that word feels changes. So, yeah,
Same thing with failure, right? We talked about that all the time.
absolutely. So, do we want to create a new nosology?
Well, if we knew what that meant.
New words and new language, right?
Nosology?
Nosology, yeah. It's what we use for like clinical terminology.
It's a big word that means
Nosology.
big word. Is that really what you just said?
Maybe lexicon. my point is, isn't it funny that we have discomfort with certain words because there's this generally accepted idea that they immediately are negative? Diagnosis is a good example of that. People eschew even telling their clients what the diagnosis is or talking about a diagnosis because that word means something bad. The reverse is true. It's something really positive because it's a descriptive summary of a complex set of things that are happening in reality.
In truth. But if the first impression of that is identity,
Yep. Good.
then you're fucked. And again, it's the same thing. It's the proper word, but it's the first initial reaction to it.
Yep. So what would we call that in the framework? Not to put you on the spot, but it's a rhetorical kind of question, but a real one.
What would we call that in the framework of a rule dispute?
Well, there's a mechanism that you're currently describing. I'm not sure if you're noticing it.
Well, clearly I'm not.
The meaning
We
assigned
spit it
to
out 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, the meaning assigned to events.
Oh shit, I like that one.
I know you do. That's why I'm bringing it up.
Mm.
So notice, experiencing that word is an event.
Yeah.
And we're assigning meaning to it.
Mm.
And we got to be skeptical and cautious and careful about the meaning we assign to events because that's normally where we make errors, right? So if we have a knee-jerk reaction, a quick and dirty reaction to how the word diagnosis feels, right? Maybe a rule's being broken, right? But what is the meaning we just assigned to that event? Oh, we're talking about a defect. We're talking about something to be embarrassed about or ashamed of. No, we're not. But that's the meaning we assign to it. So be very intentional and very thorough and very cautious about the meaning we assign to events. And the hearing of a word can be a wonderful example of just that.
That's a big buzzword too in my field too. So diagnosis,
Yeah. And it's probably
doesn't always indicate a deficit.
Yeah, deficit or defect. Right. Notice the word disorder. That's another one. But what does it actually mean? Does it mean that you're fucked up? No. It literally means something's out of order. That's all. It just means something's out of order.
It's taken everything in my bones to hold in the golf joke right now. But I feel like it's overplayed, so I'm not going to do it. I'm going to keep it in myself.
Oh, you can't tease us like that. That's not fair.
I'm just saying. You're welcome.
What? Oh, you're going to make a joke about me?
Oh shit!
No, you can. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, I thought that was you want to start something?
No.
Go on air.
Yeah. I would say one of our playing partners has delusional disorder because he thinks he's a better putter than I am, and the undeniable observable data is that that's not the case.
And then there's this guy who has to listen to this shit all the time.
It's part of the thrill, right? Part of the experience. All right.
It's a package.
Yeah. So meaning assigned to events. That can happen on something as seemingly inconsequential as word usage. But notice,
Mhm.
we have an entire sort of industry and cultural segment that is devoted to what? Trigger words. So, off the top of our head, we could come up with 20 words that could incite 70% of the population
Mhm.
simply because of the meaning of those things.
Yeah.
So as you're
Hmm.
listening, as you're thinking through these things, as you're trying to understand, okay, how do I apply the framework to my everyday life and make it better? Because that's what this is all about. Remember those fundamental concepts. We got to scrutinize the meaning that we assign to events. Because when we assign meaning, a conclusion takes root and we operate from that conclusion as if it's true. Important to know if that if that conclusion can weather the storm of skepticism. Asking, okay, is this real? Is there evidence to support this? And if there is, great. If there isn't, then we know now we need to replace that negative false conclusion with something that is reality and evidence based.
Mhm.
That's the difference between being adaptive and maladaptive in that.
Evidence beyond the feeling,
Right,
usually.
right. And the feeling can help us find the evidence, but the feeling is not
Right.
the evidence. Yeah. Okay. Third one, to know thyself is to understand and be aware of, interestingly, our place in the world, our place.
Mm.
What do you think that means? Or where does that take you?
Place in the world.
Mhm.
Well, so first off, it seems to be clearly a relational issue.
Mm. Mm.
When I think about the world, obviously, it's not geographic. Uh, and I would assume that we're gonna be talking about our perceived place
Mhm.
in relationally, how people view us, how we view ourselves,
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah. To find my place in the world is to find my relationship with the world I'm in. Here, I think, really is where we find the identity piece so
Mm.
frequently and so intensely. Um, One of the famous contributions to psychological literature comes from Eric Erickson, who talks about the psychosocial stages of
Fucking love that
development.
guy.
Yeah. And we have these developmental milestones that are marked
Mhm.
by crises that happen throughout the developmental lifespan. And they're things that we need to resolve. And the idea is if we don't resolve one, but we chronologically age to the next one that's coming, we're likely to get stuck, right? Because we haven't resolved that one.
Mhm.
One of those stages is really about this, our place in the world, trying to understand, you know, identity, industry, you know, what's my contribution to this world? What's my place? Whether that's what's my career, my job? Do I have children or do I not have children? Do I, all of those things. Where is my place in the world? And one of the things that we're talking off air with regard to identity and identity disturbance, you said it, really well. People who build and own and run companies, when they retire, there's this very often horrendous identity struggle and proneness to
Mhm.
depression and sadness and loss of identity.
Mhm.
Well, we no longer have what we think is our place in the world. Our place in the
Mhm.
world has changed.
We talk about that a lot in terms of the language that we use is regarding valued roles.
Mm,
And certainly, to your example, when someone holds a role that they are, it is perceived as valuable by the people around them. It feels good when you have it. It's a bitch when you lose it,
mhm,
um, because
mhm,
it is very easy to get our identities tied to those
mhm,
roles. And certainly, if you don't have any at all, then you're fucked.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
anyway,
And
which is rare, by the way. You'll typically find a negative role. If you feel if there's no quote unquote roles at all, you'll go negative
yeah,
rather than going without.
right, right.
Anyway,
And that phenomenon that we're talking about in a very real way is the rules were changed
hmm,
because roles come from rules. Retirement is a massive change in the rules.
hmm,
If we think about it differently, if I believe as a matter of value and rule that one of the things I want to do with and for my romantic partner is to protect them, then that is part of my place in the world. I'm a protector of my love. But if that person is doing things that prevent me from being able to do that, or is resistant to it, or whatever, then I can question my place in the world. I can question that through this rule dispute.
hmm,
Now, other people may have a different place in the world. It may not be partner related, but all of it is relational because it's your relationship to your world, to the world. So, understanding that as a relationship, having learned from this framework podcast that everything is relationship, everything is. When you realize you have a relationship to your place in the world, that's a really important part of knowing thyself. One of the most common places where I see this is when a person fears, thinks, or believes that they're behind. And some situations where that happens most commonly is when a person, for example, goes to college and messes up and stuff like that, and they get lost or they can't figure out what their major is or they do poorly in school. And then the people that they started with, they finish sort of on time and then they promote in life and they get jobs and they start careers. And then the person feels behind and they're questioning their place in the world.
hmm,
One of the most awful things that women go through is the expectation that their place in the world has to be as mother who births children. And so if you're a woman who, for whatever reason, says or decides that you don't want to have children, oh my gosh, the shame and the punishment and the consternation that comes from that, the questions that come from that. One of the first questions that a woman is usually asked after, are you married or whatever is, so do you have kids? Even before, what do? You have kids.
hmm.
That is part of the societal rule that a woman's place in the world is to reproduce and have kids and be a mother. So, what happens if you're a woman and you're not interested in that? You can really struggle with understanding your place in the world and certainly struggle with feelings of guilt and shame and inadequacy because you were thought of as a person from early childhood that would do that.
Hmm. Is that common?
Is what common?
Feeling behind?
Yeah, because
I could see that being like really, really emasculating
very
in a lot of scenarios.
it's incredibly damaging because what drives that is this comparison business, having to compare ourselves
Hmm,
to other people.
hmm,
It's sort of like keeping up with the Joneses, but on a whole other different scale. So if I'm behind, there's this sort of idea or set of rules that there's a timeline and a set of boxes that I got to check to be okay, to be normal, to be successful, to be productive, you know. So that template could be, I got to graduate from college in 4 years. And if it takes me longer than 4 years, I'm a fuck up. And, and then I got to get a job, and then I got to get engaged and get married. And then I got to get a house, and I got to do all that. That's one.
So is that all just other people's rules, though? Is that society's rules?
Absolutely.
So the whole I guess it would. I guess it could either be other people or yourself. If you feel behind, might have a rule of where you thought you should be, or where you felt like you needed to be, and you
Absolutely.
aren't. Right.
Right. And very often those rules are written by someone else.
Yeah.
In another context, those rules may be, I got to find a way to use athletics as a vehicle for social mobility, or musical talent as a vehicle for social mobility, and get out of this circumstance. And then I got to bring people with me, because if I don't bring people with me and bring other people up, then I've abandoned my community, and I've abandoned my responsibility as a successful person, or whatever. There's all kinds of different routes to that. But yeah, the sense or the feeling of being behind can lead to feelings of alienation, isolation, thoughts that we're failures, that we're not good enough, that we have to become apologists for certain things. I will submit to you that in the last 10 or 15 years, one of the places where I see this most commonly actually is divorced dads. And the reason they feel behind is because they went through financial ruin and emotional destruction as a result of divorce, especially if there were kids there, because they've lost so much,
Half their shit.
likely that,
Not to make jokes.
yeah, no, but, in half their time
Mm-hmm.
with their children, especially if you have an ex-partner who is running a campaign of parental alienation, which so many people do to men, right? And then call men deadbeat dads. But, you give up, half of your possessions, you give up pieces of your retirement or your 401k, your savings, your assets, whatever. And compared to your peers, how are you living? Now you're in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment without a whole lot of furniture, without much in the kitchen. You're lacking basic competencies because you relied on your wife to do all these things as essentially your second mother, and you don't know how to cook, and you don't know how to do laundry, and you don't know how to arrange things socially, and because the only thing that you did was go to work and then come home and play video games or whatever. I mean, it could be something like that. But the point is, all of a sudden, you're very, very behind and feeling angry, frustrated, sad, alone, erased, forgotten, dismissed as a man, as a father, as a husband, as a person. And when you think about what is your plan to get to retirement? You're behind, right? You're behind significantly now because of all of the horrendous and painful things that can happen as a result of a divorce, especially an ugly one. So, by the way, no real surprise then that the number one category of suicide completion is males 45 to 55. Because it's right then and there when those divorces with those kids are happening. I'm not saying that that's the cause effect relationship between the two, but what I am saying is that of the percentage of men who complete suicide, 45 to 55, 45 to 55 is the most common area where we're going to see divorces occur, and divorces with children. And I'm sure that there's a relationship there somewhere. I can't speak to what it is empirically, but it just makes sense pragmatically. Because you've lost so much and you're behind. And by the way, what's your place in the world now? If you've lost your role as full-time father, lost your role as husband, lost your role as provider or contributor, whatever it is, now, you're single, you're that old guy at the club, that kind of, that joke. You're trying to rebuild your life. Where's your place in the world if you've lost all your friends or didn't do a good job of maintaining your friend group when you're married, and all of a sudden you feel absolutely by yourself? And everybody else you know is married with kids, and they're busy in their married life and their kid life, and nobody seems to have time, and you don't want to be the third wheel, and so you isolate more. And so now you're in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, and your kids are with your ex, and you don't have any friends to call, and you don't have a whole lot of money. And what are you doing? You're heating a frozen pizza, and you're watching Netflix, and you're wondering what the hell happened to your life. You're wondering, where's my place in this world? And trying to find a place in the world, having gone through all of that at 45 to 55, or really any age. And in particular, if you're lacking competence in things, social skills, practical skills, life skills, whatever. Oh my gosh, is that an incredibly daunting thing for a person to go through, male or female?
Well, I wasn't aware that you were gonna like read my diary from fucking 5 years ago or something. But you just
I
you,
was.
that was pretty well articulated of
Mm.
what my divorce was like. Anyway.
Well, when you ask, do you see this sense of people being behind frequently?
Mhm.
My answer was yes, and I wanted to explain why that answer was yes and where it most often shows up. But I would say it shows up for people who are struggling to get through college or never went through college. It shows up in the decision to get married and have kids, especially if you're female. It shows up for uh, approaching middle age or middle aged men who are going through divorce when they have kids. Those are the three. In my own clinical experience, my own clinical practice, that's where I see it the most. I'm sure
Mhm.
that there's a lot of other areas that maybe other clinicians see it too. There's also no better way to be alone than to feel like you have to suppress sexual identity, all kinds of ways in which that can happen, and question your place in the world, in your world.
So now that both of our viewers have totally identified with that tremendously, I think. Um, what? Make the connection between that, because I think that there's usually, well, for me again, being there and because that's exactly where I was at when we met. Where I went through that early on when we met. Um, it's very easy to feel very stuck
Oh gosh, yes.
in that spot.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate enough to have, you around to help guide me through and teach me a lot of these things
Mm,
through all of that, which I'll always be grateful for.
mm,
But for someone just listening to this, like hearing that and like, fuck, yes, yeah, it's me.
mhm,
What is next? What's my next step in front of me is what?
mm. Yeah, where do I start?
Mhm. Other than calling a therapist.
Well, yeah,
We
do
do
that.
that.
Give me a call,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether it's therapy or consulting or someone else. But, you know, really and truly, my answer to that question is work the framework. And we begin with the why. And we begin with understanding your nature and what are the rules. We begin understanding the difference between prohibitive and affirmative thinking. Because when we get those things sort of fixed, those things corrected in our thinking, that's the path out of all of these things. And it's the path towards crafting our new place in the world. Because if you are that guy, you really identified with that or that girl or whatever, know that on the other side of all of this pain and this destruction is a new place in the world, and that place can be unbelievably liberating, unbelievably satisfying. So, for example, if you feel devastated because you've lost your ability to sort of parent the way that you want to, understand that now that you're a single parent, you have whatever visitation agreement you have, the limits on how you can be a parent now have changed for the positive because you're not being as influenced by your partner, and you can be the kind of father that you want to be or the kind of mother that you want to be. You get to rewrite the rules for what that is and how that works. There's a lot of things to be encouraged by. There's a lot of things that lead to crafting and manufacturing that new place in the world. We can't get there if we're loaded with prohibitive thinking, if we have a prohibitive why, if we have bad rules. So the number one thing that we start doing in a situation like that, any of that, is, all right, what's my why? And I'm going to understand and be aware of my nature. What is that? The rule inventory. That is the first moment of awareness and empowerment. And when that is undisturbed or unaffected by prohibitive thinking, then it is a huge growth moment. Because then it helps us understand in a pragmatic, realistic, honest, adaptive way what our limits are. And we now know limits are not something to be embarrassed about or afraid of. There's something to embrace, is empowering, because now we know we can play within ourselves. We know where our growth opportunities are. But we're not overextending. And, like, for example, we're not putting our best foot forward when we go out dating. We're putting our authentic foot forward. We're being honest about limitations and going with that instead of being embarrassed or ashamed or humiliated by them. And in doing all that, we start to find a place in the world. And that's how you do that. That's why I think the framework is so powerful and useful, because it is applicable in a global sense. And a big reason why is because it's value free. It does not contain my values or yours. It is a way for someone to organize their values. They take all of their values and they plug them in. The framework is a system. It's a system that we teach. It's a system that, when applied and applied consistently, leads to autonomy and empowerment. Autonomy meaning you get good enough at this, you can do this yourself. And that's the goal of all therapy. The goal of all therapy, the goal of all consulting, is to conclude it. Not the process, but the actual therapeutic experience. Success is when you no longer need me. And then, of course, you can come back for a tune-up, or you can come back when something else emerges, always, of course. But the goal is to become autonomous. And the framework helps you do that when consistently applied.
Yeah.
So that's how you start.
I love it. The you always, seems like we always start so many of these talking about moving from prohibitive to affirmative thinking.
Yeah.
And the whole time I was just, most of the time you were talking, it seems like so much of what I felt and what I've seen is the prohibitive thought of, I'll never be okay.
Mm.
And when you can switch that into, I will be okay,
Mm-hmm.
and know how to get there,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of like really believe that.
Yep.
Uh, Everything, your limits are constantly moving
Mm-hmm.
in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're no longer artificial.
Right.
Those limits are no longer artificial because they're not fear-based.
Yeah.
And remember, we're talking about the power of thinking here. Don't forget what we teach. Where the mind goes, the ass follows. Our thinking influences our behavior, which in turn is what changes our experience emotionally and pragmatically. So when you learn how to think better, when you are in possession of thinking tools and communication tools, which is what the framework is, that's how you liberate yourself. The unexamined life is a life without thinking. And that's very close to our operational definition of habit, especially bad habit, but any habit. Habit is behavior in the absence of thought. So if you want to break a habit, if you want to establish a new habit, what do you have to do? You have to restore thought. To know thyself is to think, not to judge, not to shame, not to fear, not to avoid, to think, to engage and use your brain. The examined life is the life where you know yourself. And that's a lifelong journey. It's a lifelong journey, whether you're in therapy or out of therapy. So if you need help, reach out. But also remember, the best way to help yourself is to change the way you think. And sometimes that change is start thinking. Your feelings matter, of course. Your feelings are real, of
Start
course.
thinking for yourself.
Yes,
Yeah.
thinking for yourself.
Mhm.
And how do you do that? Examining your nature. You know what your rules are, whether you know it or not. You know what your values are. The thing that's likely in the way is A, you haven't thought about it, or B, you're not accepting it. You're not acknowledging that that reality exists. You believe someone else's rule that you shouldn't think that way or feel that way or have that value or that need. And so many of you think you're bad if you have needs. I mean, that's how basic we often have to get.
Mhm.
People are so committed to making sure that they're not needy that they're trying to talk themselves out of even the possession of needs.
Mhm.
Well, how the hell do you do needs advocacy and then need fulfillment if you're shaming yourself in the identification process and trying to talk yourself into the idea that you shouldn't have needs, and the more you don't have needs, the better potential partner you're going to be? What? Are you kidding me? But I would say so many people believe that very thing, and then they wonder why their relationships are a shit show.
You're considerate if you don't have needs.
Right?
It's a gift if you don't have
It's a
needs.
gift. Yeah.
You're
Right.
welcome.
You're
I'm not a burden.
right.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And all that is prohibitive thinking because it's, I don't want to be needy. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to, oh my gosh.
Mhm.
Right. Look at how destructive bad thinking is and can be. And when people talk about breaking cycles, about breaking habits, listen, nothing is harder to do than disrupt or break those patterns. That's why therapy and consulting exists. At its core, it exists to help people disrupt patterns, thinking, perception, communication, interaction, disrupt those patterns. It's the hardest thing to do. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's hard. And that's why I say this is the heavy lifting, because it is. It's hard because we're unaccustomed to trusting our brains. We're unaccustomed to using our brains. We're accustomed to being hijacked by our emotions, living by rules written by other people, dominated by prohibitive thinking. And when that happens, how the hell can you know yourself? And if you can't know yourself, if you can't do self awareness, how can you do relationship awareness? You can't. That's why so many people struggle and so many people suffer. This podcast, this work, all of it is designed to empower and liberate people from the torment of that kind of existence. It doesn't have to be that way. And the only thing you need is your brain and some thinking tools and some reps and some practice with some support and some guidance. And that's what the framework is all about. That's what the framework is designed to do.
Well, thank you everyone for watching tonight's episode on all the reasons Tyler's fucked up, and in all the ways that
And all the ways that David is. And certainly was. I mean, I used to be really fucked up. I'm less fucked up now than I used to be, right?
I am too.
The point is we all are.
Yeah.
But though we're being humorous, remember, Tyler's not fucked up. David's not fucked up. You're not fucked up. Your thinking is.
Mm.
My thinking often is. Yours can be, right? It's the thinking that is fucked,
Yeah.
not the person. We can unfuck the thinking. And when we do that, we unfuck ourselves. So know yourself. Endeavor to examine your life instead of leading an unexamined life. The peace, the wisdom that comes and is available in this life starts when you allow yourself to better understand you and the world that you're in and your place in it. Your nature is your rules and your values. Your limits are your source of empowerment. Your place in the world is up to you. It's up to you. It's not up to anyone else. It's up to you.